A police officer was walking downtown with his little girl when they stopped at a street corner where a ragged man was holding a sign that read, $5 for the beast. Behind the sign sat an old German shepherd, ribs showing, one ear bent, and scars all over his body. The little girl tugged her father's sleeve and begged, "Please, Daddy, can we save him?" He hesitated, but the moment their eyes met, something inside him broke. This was not just a dog, it was a soul crying for one last chance. What happened after he paid those $5 would uncover a hidden world of cruelty, rescue, and redemption, a journey that would forever change their lives and restore your faith in miracles. What happened next will make you cry and believe in second chances again. Before we start, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments, as I'd love to see how far this story travels. The summer sun of Montana pressed down on the small town of Clearbrook like a wary hand, warming the red brick storefronts and shimmering against the dusty pavement. It was late afternoon, the kind of golden hour when the air carried both the fatigue of the day and the promise of cooler twilight. A light breeze rattled the tin sign above the old diner, and children's laughter echoed faintly from a park 2 blocks away. Officer Ethan Miller walked slowly along Main Street with his daughter, savoring a rare day off. Ethan was 38, tall and broad-shouldered, with short brown hair touched faintly by early grays at the temples. His gray eyes, often described as calm yet burdened, carried the wear of too many years on the police force. His clean-shaven face showed lines that were not just from age, but from the residue of a marriage that had ended bitterly 3 years prior. Since then, he had thrown himself into raising his daughter and into his work, wearing responsibility like a shield. Beneath his navy polo and worn jeans was a man who looked steady to others, but inside he often wrestled with loneliness. Beside him skipped Sophie Miller, 9 years old, her blonde hair tied into a messy ponytail that bounced as she moved. She had Ethan's gray eyes, but none of his heaviness, as hers were bright and filled with the kind of hope only a child can hold. She wore a pale yellow sundress with white sneakers that had already collected dust from summer play. Sophie was curious, talkative, and endlessly compassionate, a trait she had inherited from her late grandmother, who had spent her life caring for stray animals. Sophie often reminded Ethan of his mother, which both warmed him and made him ache. As they walked past the grocery and the shuttered bookstore, Ethan caught sight of a figure sitting hunched at the corner near the bus stop. The man was Harold Boone, or at least that was the name Ethan would later recall from a complaint once filed about public loitering. Harold was a man in his 50s with skin leathery from years outdoors, his beard scraggly and unkempt, streaked with gray. His clothes hung loosely, a faded plaid shirt, torn jeans, and boots with their soles half gone. He carried the aura of someone who had slipped through society's cracks long ago. His eyes darted about nervously, and though he looked wary, there was something sly beneath the surface, like a man accustomed to surviving through half-truths. But it wasn't Harold who made Sophie stop in her tracks. Beside him, tethered loosely by a fraying rope, lay an old German shepherd. The dog's coat was sable but old with grime, streaked with patches of gray around the muzzle and legs. Its ribs were faintly visible beneath the thinning fur, and one ear bent awkwardly, as if broken long ago and never healed properly. The dog's hind leg trembled when it tried to shift, suggesting an old injury that still haunted its steps. Yet the most striking thing were its eyes, deep, dark brown, glossy with pain, but carrying a flicker of life that refused to die. A battered piece of cardboard leaned against Harold's knee, scrawled in black marker with the words, $5 for the beast. Sophie gasped, her small hand instinctively tightening around her father's fingers. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice almost trembling, "Look at him." Ethan's eyes followed hers, seeing a dog that should have been proud and strong, now reduced to a shadow of itself. He had seen neglected animals before in his line of work, but something about this one, the quiet dignity even in its suffering, made his chest tighten. Ethan's practical side stirred. "Sweetheart," he said softly, "we don't know this dog. He could be dangerous, and we already have enough to handle at home." But Sophie wasn't listening. She had crouched down, her sundress brushing the sidewalk, and was staring into the shepherd's eyes. The dog lifted its head slightly, meeting her gaze. For a moment, the busy street, the honking cars, and the sweltering sun all seemed to fade. In those eyes, Sophie saw not a beast, but a soul pleading for mercy. "Please," Sophie begged, looking up at him with her gray eyes brimming with tears. Ethan hesitated, looking at Harold Boone, who gave a half smirk. $5, officer. That's all it takes. He ain't worth more than that anyway." The casual cruelty in Harold's tone made Ethan's jaw tighten, as he hated the way the man referred to the shepherd, as if life could be measured in coins. Ethan pulled his wallet from his back pocket, staring at the bills. He didn't need another mouth to feed, especially not one that might come with vet bills and complications. But Sophie's hand was still clutching his, her voice quivering with urgency. Daddy, Ethan sighed deeply. His daughter rarely begged for anything, and truthfully, the thought of walking away from those brown eyes felt unbearable. "Fine," Ethan muttered, pulling out a $5 bill. "But has your responsibility, Sophie." Sophie's face lit up, brighter than the sun overhead, and she sprang up to throw her arms around Ethan's waist. "Thank you, Daddy, thank you." He handed the bill to Harold, who snatched it quickly, stuffed it into his pocket, and muttered, "Pleasure doing business." Before Ethan could say another word, Harold slung his backpack over his shoulder and shuffled down the street, disappearing into the crowd with surprising speed. It was as if the moment the money was in his hand, he couldn't get away fast enough. Ethan frowned, unsettled by the man's hurried retreat. People usually lingered, but Harold moved like he wanted no part of what came next. Meanwhile, Sophie was kneeling beside the dog, gently stroking its matted fur. "Well, take care of you now," she whispered softly. "You're safe." The shepherd gave a faint, almost imperceptible wag of its tail. Its tongue lolled slightly, and for the first time, a fragile sound, half sigh, half whimper, escaped its throat. "What should we call him, Daddy?" Sophie asked, glancing up at Ethan with hope brimming in her voice. Ethan crouched down beside her, studying the dog. The scars across its neck and the limp in its legs spoke of a long, cruel history. He felt an old ache stirring inside him, the same one that often rose when he thought of the people he hadn't been able to save in his career. "Well, think of something," Ethan said gently, running his hand once over the dog's head. The coarse fur prickled against his palm, but beneath it, he felt the faint tremor of life, steady and waiting. Sophie beamed, hugging the dog carefully around its neck. "You're ours now, don't worry, we're not letting you go." Ethan looked at his daughter, then at the animal, and for a fleeting second, he wondered if this choice would change more than just the fate of one battered shepherd. Something about the way the dog looked at Sophie, as if recognizing her, unsettled and comforted him at once. The breeze picked up, carrying the scent of fried food from the diner, and the far-off rumble of a train as the evening shadows stretched longer across Main Street. Ethan stood, adjusting his stance, and glanced down the road where Harold Boone had disappeared. The man was gone without a trace, leaving behind only the echo of his cruel sign and the haunting question of why he had parted with the dog so cheaply. For Ethan, a seasoned officer, that detail would not be forgotten. But for Sophie, holding the shepherd's scarred head against her shoulder, none of that mattered. She had saved him, and in that moment, she felt like he had saved her too. The next morning, the sun slid gently over the rooftops of Clearbrook, casting soft light across Ethan's modest backyard. Dew clung to the grass like tiny crystals, and the breeze carried the scent of pine and faint echoes of a world slowly waking. Birds chirped over the fence, and somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower buzzed into life. Ethan stood on the back porch, coffee steaming in his hand, watching his daughter crouched on the patio with a bottle of dog shampoo and a big blue bucket filled with lukewarm water. The shepherd lay quietly beside her, head resting on its front paws, eyes half-lidded but observant. Sophie had been up at sunrise, determined to give their new friend a proper welcome. They had named him Bruno, a name Sophie had chosen after watching an old cartoon the night before. His strong like a bear shed said, and Ethan had chuckled, though the name did seem to suit the battered old dog surprisingly well. Sophie wore an oversized t-shirt with faded unicorns and bike shorts, her hair tied into twin pigtails, and a pink towel slung over one shoulder. She moved with quiet focus, occasionally glancing at Bruno's face for permission before touching him. He hadn't barked once since arriving, nor had he growled or whimpered. He just observed, watched, and endured. Ethan set his mug down and joined them in the yard, kneeling beside Sophie. "Need help?" he asked. Sophie nodded without looking up. "Hold his head still while I wash around the eyes. I don't want soap to sting." Bruno didn't resist, barely moving as Ethan cupped his hands gently around the dog's broad skull. The fur was thicker here, coarser, and still matted in places. Sophie squeezed the bottle, and the shampoo foamed across Bruno's back in swirls of white and gray. Then, as her hands worked through the layers of filth, her fingers paused. "Daddy," she said softly, "come look." Ethan leaned closer. Beneath the suds, circling the dog's neck like a ghost collar, was a deep, hairless groove. The skin was puckered and slightly raised, and it extended toward the chest where it disappeared beneath thick fur. Sophie touched it gently. "It's a scar," she whispered, like he wore something too tight for a long time. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Or like someone kept him chained," he muttered. As they rinsed and toweled off the rest of Bruno's body, more signs became visible: thin scars across the ribs, a missing patch of fur near the tail, and most notably, his back right leg bore the signs of an old fracture. He limped slightly, favoring it each time he shifted position. Sophie frowned, her eyes wet with concern. Who would hurt a dog like this? Ethan didn't answer at first. He ran a hand over Bruno's head, feeling the slight tremble beneath the skin. "Some people," he finally said, "shouldn't be allowed near animals. That's all." "Do you think he was a police dog?" Sophie asked, "or a soldier's dog?" "Could be," Ethan replied, studying the dog's posture. He was alert but calm, disciplined even in pain, and moved like he had been trained. Bruno sneezed once, then looked up at Sophie as if he understood every word. She smiled and wrapped her arms gently around his neck, careful not to press too hard against the scar. "He's not just a dog," Sophie whispered. "He's a survivor." Later that afternoon, they sat on the porch together. Ethan was reading the newspaper while Sophie drew pictures of Bruno in her sketchbook, and the old shepherd lay sprawled beside her, breathing slow and steady. Every now and then, Sophie would talk to him in a low voice, telling him stories about her school, her favorite ice cream flavor, and about her mom, though that part came quieter. "She left when I was 6, Sophie said, scratching behind Bruno's ear. "It was just a regular day, and she didn't come back. Daddy says it's complicated, but I think she just didn't love me enough. Bruno shifted his head onto her lap. She looked down at him, eyes wide. But it's okay. I have Daddy, and now I have you. From behind his newspaper, Ethan heard every word, his hand stilling for a moment. He didn't speak, just watched as Bruno thumped his tail faintly against the porch floor. As the sun dipped lower, a sharp barking erupted from across the fence. Rufus, the large black mastiff belonging to their neighbor, lunged at the wooden boards with a deep growl. Rufus was known in the neighborhood for being territorial and unpredictable, especially when unleashed. Sophie startled, her colored pencil scattering. Bruno jerked upright, his ears perked and his gaze locked on the fence. Rufus barked again, snarling, and a thud echoed as he slammed his weight against the boards. Before Ethan could rise, Bruno had moved. The old shepherd pushed himself up, limped down the porch steps, and took a wide stance between Sophie and the direction of the barking. He didn't growl or bark back, just stood firm, body still and tail stiff, as if drawing in an invisible line. Sophie remained behind him, holding her breath. After one final bark, Rufus stopped, and silence fell over the yard as the mastiff slunk away behind the fence. Ethan blinked. Well, I'll be damned. Sophie grinned. He protected me. Bruno turned his head slightly, as if checking that Sophie was safe, then slowly lowered himself to the grass with a groan. Ethan approached and knelt beside him. That took guts, he murmured, rubbing the shepherd's chest. You may be old, but you've still got it. That night, as Ethan tucked Sophie into bed, she clutched her stuffed bunny in one arm and whispered, "Can he sleep in my room?" Ethan hesitated. Bruno was old. What if he growled in his sleep? What if he snapped from pain? But then he saw Sophie's eyes, hopeful and trusting, and saw the scarred silhouette of the dog, curled just outside her door. "All right," he said, "but only if he stays on the rug." Bruno limped into the room as if he had understood, circled twice beside her bed, and collapsed with a sigh. Sophie reached down and brushed his fur. "Good night, Bruno." And for the first time in a long time, the house felt full again. It was just past 2 a.m. in Clearbrook when Ethan awoke to the sound of claws scratching against hardwood. At first, he thought it was the wind stirring through the shutters, but then came a low, guttural growl, deep and unrelenting. Ethan sat up in bed, his hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight on the nightstand. He moved quietly down the hallway, barefoot, past Sophie's closed door. The noise grew louder, scratching, whining, and a sharp, insistent bark. Bruno was in the kitchen, pacing near the back door, his tail stiff and ears alert, the bent one twitching in agitation. His entire body pointed toward something outside, something unseen. The dog's growl grew deeper when Ethan approached. Ethan opened the door, and Bruno surged forward, not with the wobble of an old dog, but with surprising speed and precision. Ethan barely had time to grab his flashlight and jacket before the shepherd disappeared around the side of the house. "Bruno?" he called into the darkness, but the dog didn't stop. Ethan followed, the beam of his flashlight slicing through the night mist that had crept in low and heavy. The air smelled faintly of oil and earth. Crickets fell silent as his boots crunched down the gravel path that led behind the neighborhood's old boundary fence. Bruno's silhouette was visible now and then in the beam, weaving in and out of overgrown brush, pausing only to glance back and make sure Ethan followed. They moved past the abandoned railroad track that split Clearbrook from the old industrial zone, a collection of rusted-out warehouses and condemned storage lots that the town never bothered to demolish. Ethan hadn't been back here in years. Bruno finally stopped in front of a tall chain-link fence partially collapsed under the weight of time. Behind it stood a structure Ethan barely remembered, Lot 16, once a shipping depot, now overtaken by weeds and shadows. Bruno whined and pushed his nose into a gap in the fence, his body rigid with tension. Ethan crawled through after him, flashlight sweeping over the peeling walls and broken windows. Bruno darted toward a side entrance where the metal door hung crookedly on its hinges. The dog waited for Ethan to catch up, then nosed his way inside. The air was thick with rot. Inside, Ethan squinted against the beam of his light. The warehouse floor was coated with dirt, sawdust, and something darker. The air smelled like wet rust and old urine. Then the beam hit metal. Rows of old kennels, some stacked and some collapsed, stretched along the far wall. Most were empty, their doors hanging open like broken mouths, but in a few, the latches were still closed, though the cages inside were filled only with filth and the gnawed remains of old collars. Bruno growled lowly, the sound rumbling from his chest. Ethan stepped carefully toward the cages. One held a faded dog tag, Juno. Another had a torn blanket with blood dried into its fibers. He touched the edge of one rusted kennel, and it wobbled dangerously, revealing scratch marks etched deep into the floor beneath. Then came the click. Ethan turned fast, his hand moving to the grip of the revolver at his waist. The sound had come from deeper inside, behind a partition of crates. Bruno had already begun to move, body low and muscles tense. They rounded the crates together. No one was there, but Ethan found evidence. A pile of boxes had been stacked in a way that created a makeshift wall. Behind it, an old desk with a filing cabinet stood coated in dust. Ethan opened the top drawer. Inside were logbooks with names of dogs, breeds, weights, and dollar amounts. The back page was marked with a faded red stamp, Ax 14 hold for pickup. Ethan's stomach turned. He remembered now a case from 2 years ago. There had been whispers of a dog smuggling operation in Clearbrook, with people reporting strange vans at night and dogs howling in abandoned areas, but nothing had stuck. No witnesses, no hard evidence. The town didn't have the resources to follow it through. He had let it go. Now the guilt settled heavy in his chest. Bruno stood beside one of the crates, his nose pressed against the wood, and barked once, sharply. Ethan opened the top. It was empty, except for a dirty bowl and a torn nylon leash. On the side of the crate, a number had been spray-painted in Blackroo, number 24. Ethan leaned back, running a hand through his hair. This wasn't just someone keeping strays, he muttered. Bruno whined again and looked toward the side wall. There, barely visible beneath a tarp, was a rusted cage on wheels large enough for 4 dogs. The smell was worse there, and Ethan didn't want to guess how long it had been since it was last used. He took pictures of every cage, every document, every collar and chain. Then he walked back to Bruno, who now sat watching him with unwavering eyes. "You led me here for a reason," Ethan said. "Did they do this to you?" Bruno didn't respond, of course, but in the silence, Ethan felt as if the dog already knew everything, had lived it. Maybe he had escaped. Maybe someone let him go. But one thing was clear now: Bruno hadn't just wandered into their lives. He had returned. When they made it home just before dawn, Sophie was waiting at the door in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes. "Where did you go?" she asked sleepily. Ethan knelt beside her. "Bruno took me somewhere, a bad place." Her eyes widened. Was he scared? Ethan looked at Bruno, then back at his daughter. "No," he said softly. "He was brave." The following morning, Ethan couldn't shake the images from the warehouse out of his head. The rusted cages, the bloodied blankets, the names scratched into metal all felt too intentional to be random. He sat in his small home office, coffee gone cold beside him, papers spread across the desk. Among the documents he'd taken from Lot 16 was a torn envelope, faded from time and water damage. Scribbled in faint ink were the words, Kennel X14. He typed the phrase into the state database, but found nothing useful. The code didn't match any registered facility in Montana, but it did match a shelter permit number from a case file buried in the police archives, an abandoned kennel that had once been used as a legitimate boarding service. Ethan remembered it now vaguely. The owner had died unexpectedly, and the property went into foreclosure, but no one had connected it to anything criminal at the time. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Something didn't add up. Why would a criminal ring use a defunct kennel's ID? More importantly, why did Bruno lead him straight to a place tied to it? That evening, Ethan prepared for patrol duty, slipping into his dark navy uniform and strapping on his utility belt. Bruno sat by the front door, watching with his usual stoic calm. His wounds had begun to heal, but the limp in his hind leg remained. He was a soldier in retirement, but still alert to duty. "Sorry, buddy," Ethan said, patting his head. "Not tonight. Got to handle this one alone." Unbeknownst to him from the hallway stairs, Sophie watched quietly. She wore her green hoodie and jeans, her sneakers already laced, her face holding the determined look of a girl who had made up her mind. Moments later, when Ethan's cruiser pulled away into the dusk, the side gate creaked open. The sun had nearly set when Ethan parked near the east side of town. His plan was to scout the narrow creek bridges near Route 7, areas often neglected and known for night activity. He walked the path behind the old grain silos, flashlight in hand, but found nothing suspicious. Meanwhile, Sophie crept behind the trees along the outer fence of the walking trail. She had followed the cruiser on her bike, careful to keep a few blocks back. She wasn't sure why she did it. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was fear for her dad, but she told herself she'd just stay close and then bike home. It was near the third bridge when Sophie heard it, a faint whimper beneath the concrete. She paused, looked around, then carefully climbed down the embankment. Under the bridge, among piles of leaves and broken crates, she spotted a small figure shivering in the shadows. It was a puppy, brown and tan, matted with dirt, one eye swollen shut. It looked no older than 4 months, with ribs protruding and its tail curled tightly under its belly. Sophie knelt down slowly. "Hey, it's okay," she whispered. "I won't hurt you." The puppy didn't move, just stared with tired, frightened eyes. Sophie took off her hoodie, wrapping it around the pup gently. It trembled against her chest, but didn't resist. Her heart broke as she realized how cold the animal was, how light it felt in her arms. Up on the trail, Ethan called dispatch for a routine status check when he noticed a flash of movement in the trees, a blur of green, a streak of hair, and something small in someone's arms. "Sophie," his voice sliced through the dark. She froze. "Don't be mad," she called out, stepping into the light. "I found him under the bridge." Ethan hurried over, his pulse spiking with a mix of fear and relief. "You followed me, Sophie. This isn't safe." "I know," she interrupted, her chin trembling. But he was alone and scared, just like Bruno was. Ethan sighed, placing a hand over his face. He looked down at the puppy, clearly abused and neglected. There was no way he could turn it away. They drove home in silence, with Sophie cradling the pup in her lap the whole way. Back at the house, she named him Buddy. He was a mixed breed, possibly terrier and shepherd, with floppy ears and a tiny white patch on his chest. Ethan cleaned his wounds while Sophie held his paw and whispered, "You're safe now." "I promise." Bruno approached slowly, sniffing the air. He studied Buddy from a distance, then moved closer and gave a gentle nudge to the pup's ear. The puppy whimpered but didn't shy away. Bruno lay beside him that night, positioning himself like a guardian between Buddy and the door. Ethan stood in the hallway watching the scene unfold. The older dog's protective instincts were unmistakable, and something in Ethan softened again. Later, as Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table sipping a second cup of coffee, he pulled out the old envelope again. His fingers traced the faded name Kennel X14. "Buddy's not a coincidence," he murmured. "None of this is." Bruno appeared beside him, silent as always. "You knew where to take me," Ethan said, staring into the dog's deep eyes. "And now Sophie finds another one dumped like trash." Bruno's ears twitched, but he didn't blink. "I'm not letting this go." The days following Buddy's rescue passed in a strange hush, as if the town of Clearbrook was holding its breath. Ethan couldn't get the name Kennel X14 out of his head. The deeper he looked, the fewer traces remained, as if someone had intentionally scrubbed the trail. But silence, in his experience, often screamed the loudest. Late one afternoon, he drove out toward the eastern edge of town, where the woods thickened and dirt roads stretched out like tangled veins. He had received an anonymous tip, scribbled on a slip of paper left under the windshield of his cruiser. "Check the property behind Miller's Quarry, South Path. You'll hear them before you see them." Ethan arrived in plain clothes, his badge tucked into his belt. He wore a black jacket over a faded flannel, jeans, and boots dulled by years of wear. Bruno sat in the back seat, alert but silent, his ears twitching with every sound and his gaze fixed ahead with steady intensity. As they reached the base of the hill behind the old quarry, Ethan parked beneath a thicket of pines. Bruno leapt down without waiting for a leash, his nose pressed to the ground immediately, tail stiff, moving forward like a compass drawn by memory. Ethan followed, brushing aside branches and undergrowth as they ascended the path. Then came the sound, soft at first, yelps, whimpers, and the faint clink of metal. Bruno paused near a boulder, sniffed twice, then veered sharply left, disappearing between the trees. Ethan caught up moments later and found himself staring at a makeshift compound shielded by wooden pallets and tarps. Barbed wire ringed part of the perimeter. Inside were metal kennels stacked and chained, holding over a dozen dogs. Some barked hoarsely while others lay motionless, too weak to stand. The air stank of neglect, runt food, rotting fur, rust, and excrement. Ethan's stomach turned. Then he heard footsteps behind him. He turned just as 3 men emerged from the tree line, the kind of men who didn't smile unless they meant trouble. The one in front stood with arms crossed over a sleeveless shirt that showed off tattooed forearms. His name was Vince Jargo, a local mechanic known for dicey dealings, in his mid-40s with short black hair, a thick build, and a dark goatee. His eyes were small, squinting with contempt. "Well now," Vince said, his voice slow and sticky like oil. "Didn't expect company." Behind him were Luther and Clem Leaner, both in their mid-30s with sun-worn faces and hands calloused like ranchers. Clem held a wrench, while Luther just cracked his knuckles. Ethan didn't move. "You running this?" "We're minding our business," Vince replied, glancing at Bruno. "You should mind yours." "These dogs are none of yours," Clem interrupted, stepping forward. "You ain't got a warrant, Miller. And you sure as hell don't have backup." Bruno growled low, stepping between Ethan and the men. His old body tensed like a coiled spring, ready to strike if needed. "You threatening a cop now?" Ethan asked, his voice steady. Vince tilted his head. "No, we're warning a father. Bad things happen when people dig where they shouldn't." A moment passed as the wind hissed through the trees. Ethan's fingers hovered near his phone, but he didn't reach for it, not yet. "Walk away," Vince added, his smile fading. "You got a daughter, right?" That did it. Bruno lunged forward with a bark that shook the leaves. The men flinched, and Ethan used the moment to step back, gripping Bruno's collar. "I'll be back," Ethan said, locking eyes with Vince, "with a warrant and an army." He turned, pulling Bruno along, retreating down the hill before things exploded. His heart pounded. The threat wasn't empty, and they knew Sophie's name. That terrified him more than the compound. What Ethan didn't know was that Sophie had followed him again. She hadn't meant to. She'd only wanted to bring Bruno's blanket that he left behind in the back seat. But then the car had driven off, and curiosity had outweighed fear. She had stayed hidden in the underbrush, watching everything: her father, the men, the cages. The moment she heard Vince say, "You got a daughter, right?" her heart dropped like a stone. That night, Ethan came home later than usual. Sophie was curled on the couch, Bruno at her feet, Buddy asleep in a blanket near the fireplace. She didn't say anything until Ethan hung up his jacket. "I heard them," she whispered. "I followed you." "I know I shouldn't have, but I did." Ethan froze, turning slowly. Sophie's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "They know about me, don't they?" she asked. "The men in the woods." He knelt beside her, gently taking her hands. "They do," he said quietly. "But I won't let them near you. I promise." Sophie threw her arms around him, sobbing into his chest. "Please don't go back. Please, I don't want to lose you too." Ethan held her tightly, his eyes burning. Bruno rose, stepping close and resting his head against Sophie's shoulder, a silent shield, a vow made without words. Later that night, as Ethan sat at the table reviewing case files, Bruno wandered into the room and dropped something at his feet, a rusted keyring covered in dirt. Ethan frowned, picking it up. The tag read, Unit B, Forest Locker 712X. He looked at Bruno, who only stared back. "You're not done showing me things yet," Ethan murmured. The storm rolled in just after sundown, sweeping over Clearbrook like a beast set loose. Thunder cracked above the rooftops, and heavy rain drummed against the windows in steady, relentless sheets. The entire town had gone quiet, as though holding its breath in the face of what was coming. Inside Ethan's small home, the tension was thick. Sophie sat on the edge of the couch, arms wrapped tightly around her knees. Buddy dozed at her feet, his tail twitching at every rumble outside. Bruno stood near the door, muscles tight and ears alert, as though he already sensed what lay ahead. Ethan double-checked his gear, badge clipped under his coat, flashlight, spare cuffs, and radio. His police-issued sidearm sat heavy at his hip. He'd made the call earlier that day, gathering a small unit of trusted officers for a covert operation. They'd meet him near the woods behind the quarry, armed with a warrant and ready to raid the illegal compound. But now, as he knelt in front of Sophie, he saw fear swimming in her eyes. "I don't want to stay home," she said, her voice barely above the rain's chorus. "What if they come here? What if they saw me too?" Ethan hesitated. "You'll be safe." "I don't want to be without Bruno," she whispered, burying her face into the shepherd's fur. "Daddy, let me come. I'll stay in the car. I won't get in the way." Ethan looked at Bruno, then at his daughter. He saw not just fear but determination in her face. Sophie had already stepped into this darkness, and he couldn't erase that. Truthfully, he didn't trust leaving her behind either, not tonight. "All right," he said at last, "but you stay in the car. No exceptions." She nodded quickly, her eyes brimming with relief. They left under a curtain of rain, headlights cutting through fog that hovered low over the road. Bruno rode in the back, stoic and still. Sophie sat beside him, hugging a small blanket. They met the other officers, Deputy Carla Boone, a lean woman in her early 30s with sharp eyes and a steely calm, and Officer Jordan Ree, tall and broad-shouldered, known for his quiet loyalty and unmatched tracking skills. The group huddled under the trees near the entrance to the woods. Carla had brought bolt cutters, and Jordan carried a flashlight rigged with red film to preserve night vision. Ethan briefed them quickly. Vince Jargo and at least 2 others are inside. Dogs are in cages, likely unregistered. There may be weapons. We go quiet and we go fast. I'll signal when it's time to move. Then he looked at Bruno. Find the way. The dog needed no command. Bruno bounded ahead, leading them along the forest trail with confident strides, his paws splashing silently through puddles and slick mud. He weaved around fallen branches, past mossy stumps, and through tight gaps between trees. The compound loomed ahead, almost invisible behind the rain. Tarps flapped in the wind, and dim light flickered from a lantern under the awning. Ethan raised his fist, signaling the team to split. Carla flanked right and Jordan left, while Ethan moved straight toward the cages. Sophie watched from the patrol car, heart pounding. She'd promised to stay, but something gnawed at her. She couldn't see her father or Bruno or the officers anymore, just shadows and shape-shifting behind the trees. Then she heard it, a sharp, broken bark. It wasn't Bruno. Inside the compound, Ethan moved with his weapon drawn. He reached the first cage, shining his light inside. 2 small dogs lay curled together, their eyes wide with fear. He nodded to Jordan, who began cutting the padlocks. That's when everything unraveled. A man burst from the shed swinging a crowbar. It was Luther, recognizable by his sunken cheeks and missing tooth. He lunged toward Ethan with a roar, the weapon arcing toward his side. Bruno flew. The shepherd slammed into Luther's leg, his teeth sinking into denim and flesh. Luther howled, dropping the crowbar and staggering back. Bruno released, turned, and barked again, guarding Ethan's flank. Then, through the chaos, a door creaked open from the far side of the compound. Sophie had slipped from the car. She'd seen movement, seen her father struggle, and before she could think, her feet were already in the mud. She moved past the fence, through the rain, toward the cages. One near the back held a dog that didn't bark or even lift its head. It was a female Labrador, old and battered, with a deep gash along her side. Her fur was white with patches of yellow soaked through and clinging to her thin frame. Sophie reached for the latch, rusted but loose. She opened it and dropped to her knees, whispering, "It's okay. I've got you." The dog whimpered but didn't resist as Sophie cradled her, the blood from the wounds staining the blanket she had carried. From across the lot, Ethan spotted his daughter and his heart skipped a beat. "Sophie, get back to the car now." But before she could move, Clem appeared from the shadows, sprinting toward her with a blade in hand. Ethan ran, so did Bruno. But Bruno got there first. He collided with Clem mid-swing, his jaws clamping around the man's wrist. The knife clattered to the ground as Clem screamed. Bruno didn't stop, driving forward and forcing the man into the mud with a thud. Sophie scrambled back, clutching the wounded dog, tears mixing with rain. Jordan and Carla rushed in, cuffs ready, backup following close behind. Within minutes, Clem and Luther were restrained. Vince tried to escape through the woods, but Carla's taser found him before the darkness could swallow him whole. The count fell quiet. Ethan dropped to his knees beside Sophie, wrapping both her and the bleeding Labrador in his arms. He whispered thanks against her wet hair, his heart pounding with the weight of everything they had almost lost. Bruno limped over, fur-soaked, muzzle speckled with mud and blood. He sat beside them, chest-heaving, eyes on Ethan. "You saved us," Ethan said, and Bruno, the old broken dog no one had wanted, simply lowered his head and rested it against Sophie's leg. The storm had passed, but the air still held a lingering heaviness, as if the land itself remembered what had happened the night before. The woods near the quarry were quiet now, with no more barking and no more cries, but the memory of 40 cages and the stench of fear still clung to Ethan's senses like wet smoke. At the precinct, processing paperwork from the raid had taken most of the morning. By noon, all three men, Luther, and the man behind it all, Joe Carter, were locked in holding cells awaiting transfer. Ethan stared at the file on his desk. The name was unmistakable: Joe Carter, a man he hadn't seen in nearly 6 years, a man he thought had vanished from Clearbrook after a string of minor arrests and shoddy dealings. But here he was again, older, more hardened, and far more dangerous than before. Ethan walked down the corridor to the temporary interview room, nodding at the officer on duty. Inside, under dim fluorescent light, Joe sat with his hands cuffed to the table, looking exactly as Ethan remembered. He had a thin frame wrapped in a grimy olive jacket, a graying, untamed beard, and eyes that were sharp and amused, like a man who still believed he was holding the upper hand. "So," Joe muttered when Ethan walked in, "they send you because you used to owe me a drink, or because you're the only one dumb enough to think this matters?" "I'm here," Ethan said calmly, "because I know what you did." Joe scoffed. "I've done a lot of things." "You'll have to be more specific." Ethan sat, sliding a printed photo across the table, a shot of Bruno taken the day before, standing proudly near one of the rescue trucks. Joe's face twitched. "Well, I'll be damned. You got that mutt still alive?" "He's not a mutt," Ethan said. "He's a trained canine formerly assigned to the State Narcotics Task Force. You sold him, chained him, and left him with scars that won't ever heal." Joe shrugged, leaning back in the chair with a creak of metal. "He got injured, wasn't worth much after that. No one wants a broken dog." Ethan's voice turned low. "He still saved lives. He still protected people, even after everything you did." Joe sneered. "Then you're lucky. But don't act like he's special. He was a tool, and tools wear out." Ethan stood slowly. "You don't understand loyalty. That's why you'll never see what he's worth." He turned and left before his anger could say more. Back at home, the evening sun stretched long golden beams across the floorboards. Sophie sat in the living room beside Bruno, gently brushing his fur with her fingers. Buddy lay curled at their feet, while Hope, the injured Labrador Sophie had saved, rested on a thick towel nearby, her side bandaged but her breathing steady. Ethan walked in quietly, removed his jacket, and sat across from his daughter. She looked up at him, her eyes questioning. "Was it him?" she asked. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Joe Carter," he said. "The man who used to own Bruno." Sophie blinked, stunned. "The one who sold him." "Worse," Ethan said. "He used him until he couldn't anymore, and when Bruno got hurt, he threw him away." Silence filled the room. Sophie reached for Bruno and wrapped her arms around his neck. The dog remained still, eyes closed, breathing slow. She buried her face into his fur, her voice cracking. "I won't ever let anyone throw you away again," she whispered. "Never." Bruno turned his head slightly, resting his chin on her shoulder. Ethan felt something shift inside him, something quiet but powerful, the kind of weight that came when a child took on pain that wasn't hers and decided to turn it into love. Later that night, after tucking Sophie into bed, Ethan stood in the kitchen pouring a mug of chamomile tea when he heard soft patting behind him. Bruno entered, moving slower than usual, his limp a little more noticeable after the events of the night before. Ethan crouched beside him. "You did good, buddy," he whispered. "Better than any officer I've ever worked with." Bruno blinked once, and Ethan swore he understood every word. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver badge-shaped tag, something he'd found years ago in storage, an old K9 unit tag engraved with the word Valor. He fastened it gently to Bruno's collar. "You earned that a long time ago." Bruno leaned into him, pressing his head against Ethan's shoulder. Outside, the moon rose high over Clearbrook, and inside the quiet house, the ghosts of the past finally began to loosen their grip. Summer returned slowly to Clearbrook. The trees along Main Street turned fuller and greener, and a warm wind carried the scent of wildflowers and cedar across the hills. What once felt like a town buried in silence had begun to stir with something new, something softer. At the edge of town, just beyond the white picket fences and a winding gravel drive, Ethan's backyard had transformed. What was once an ordinary lawn was now a carefully arranged series of kennels and play areas, shaded by canvas and surrounded by a low wooden fence Sophie had painted herself in bright sky blue. There was a small shed converted into a grooming station, 2 water pumps, and a patch of soft grass where dogs now lay in the sun or chased each other between beds of daisies. Above the entrance, hung proudly on a handmade wooden post, was a sign painted in pink and white, "A home for paws." Sophie stood beneath it one morning, her hands on her hips like a general surveying a beloved kingdom. Her messy braid was tucked under a straw hat, her shorts smudged with dirt, and a determined smile stretched across her face as she watched Hope, the injured Labrador with a healing scar, wander happily across the grass. Bruno lay nearby, stretched out on a patch of shade beneath a maple tree. His eyes were half closed, but his ears twitched at every sound. His fur had grown fuller again, and though his limp remained, there was grace in the way he moved now, like time itself had decided to slow down for him. Inside the house, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, pen in hand, sorting through envelopes, donations, adoption inquiries, and messages from shelters across the state. After the bust at the compound and the rescue of over 40 dogs, Ethan's story and Bruno's had spread beyond Clearbrook. A reporter from a regional news station had interviewed them in front of the kennels. Sophie had nervously held Buddy in her lap as the cameras rolled, while Bruno sat proudly beside them, his tongue lolling. Now volunteers stopped by weekly. Blankets were dropped off in boxes, and crates of kibble and vet supplies came anonymously. A retired woman named Mrs. Rowley, who once glared from across the street when Sophie's basketball bounced into her garden, now visited twice a week with homemade dog biscuits and a thermos of sweet tea for Ethan. Mrs. Rowley was in her late 60s, sharp-boned with a tight silver bun and a voice that cracked like dry twigs when she scolded, but her hands were always gentle when she petted Bruno. Her late husband had worked with search and rescue dogs, and she claimed, "Bruno's got the same eyes. Knows more than he lets on." Ethan had smiled when she said it. He believed it too. One afternoon, while cleaning out the kennel gutters, Ethan noticed Sophie standing in the corner of the yard, staring out toward the woods. He approached. "What are you thinking?" Sophie turned slowly, rubbing the back of her neck. "Just remembering about that night," she nodded. "I was scared," she admitted, "but when Bruno stood in front of me, I wasn't anymore. It was like he told me I'd be okay without saying anything." Ethan looked down at Bruno, who had quietly padded up beside them. The shepherd sat calm and still as Sophie rested a hand gently on his head. "You know," Ethan said, "when I first brought him home, I thought I was rescuing him." Sophie smiled softly, "But he rescued us." The three of them stood there for a while, no words needed. Later that week, they hosted their first official adoption day. A few families came, some from neighboring towns. Children laughed as they played with the puppies in the yard. Hope was adopted by a young woman who had recently lost her own dog and cried when the Labrador licked her cheek. Buddy, however, refused to leave Sophie's side, and it was quietly agreed that he had already found his forever home. Bruno didn't participate in the adoption playtime. He preferred to watch from the porch, surveying the yard like a guardian. That evening, when the last guest had left and the sun hung low over the hills, casting golden light across the yard, Sophie pulled out her sketchbook. She sat on the steps and began to draw. When she was done, she showed it to Ethan. It was a picture of the house, the kennels, and the dogs. In the center sat a tall figure in a uniform with his arm around a girl. At their feet was a large German shepherd, his eyes full of light. Ethan looked at the drawing for a long time. "What's this?" he asked. Sophie shrugged. "Use and Bruno." "It's not perfect, but..." "It's perfect," Ethan said quietly. That night, as moonlight bathed the fields and the wind rustled softly through the trees, Bruno rested on the porch, his head on his paws. His breathing was steady, and his ears twitched once. In the window behind him, a family sat around the dinner table. Laughter drifted through the open screen. He had once been forgotten. Now he was home. Sometimes miracles don't come in lightning bolts or grand revelations. Sometimes they arrive quietly, limping through the rain with scarred paws and tired eyes, asking for nothing but a second chance. Bruno was more than a dog. He was a reminder that no life is ever too broken to heal, and no soul is too forgotten to be found again. Through his loyalty, he taught a grieving soldier and a lost little girl how to become a family and how to believe in goodness again. In our own lives, we all carry wounds. We all wait silently for someone to say, "You still matter." And perhaps that's the real miracle, when love finds us, even in the darkest corners. If this story moved your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Comment amen below if you believe every soul, human or animal, deserves a second chance. May God bless all those who are still waiting to be seen, to be chosen, and to come home. Subscribe to join us in telling more stories of loyalty, healing, and the quiet power of love. Drop your country in the comments. Let's see how far Bruno's story reaches. And may God bless every viewer who reads this.